Good evening.
Good evening.
This is our final evening for our closed class work. And first of all, let us go through these questions. And this is from a salesman who wants to know, how are we to know when we are being a transparency and letting God use us, or when we are trying to use God? No one knows the motives of your heart better than you do. And no one knows but you whether you are living as a transparency through which God can work, or through whom God can work, or whether you are using truth for selfish purposes. That is something that must be wrestled out within oneself. When we pray, or if we pray for our enemies, are we not asking God to do something that is within His own province? It would be if we expected God to do something for our enemies. But actually, we are never praying to God to do anything. Prayer that has words or thoughts is always indulged for our own benefit, not for God's. Prayer is to lift us into a higher atmosphere where God's grace can shine through. Therefore, when we pray that the eyes of our enemy be opened, that his mind be touched with the Spirit of God, we are not praying to God to do anything. We are lifting ourselves to where we actually want our enemies to be released from their limitations, their sins, their false sense. And if we attain a sufficient purity, then we have made ourselves a transparency through which God can reach the so-called enemy. Never believe for a moment that any prayer has for its intent to influence God to do something. That is really childish in this stage of spiritual development and religious revelation. Such thoughts may have been all right 100 years ago, but not since the advent of metaphysics. It is hardly conceivable that a metaphysician believes today that God is obeying man's wishes or satisfying man's desires. Certainly now it should be clearly understood that man is opening himself to receive God's grace, and always with a realization that thy will be done, not mine. You speak as though we have existed on this earth before. Do we return again or go on to other planes? Both. We return here and we go on to other planes until such time as full and complete union with God is established. This seems to be our way of progressing, just as while we are on earth, problems give us the only opportunity there is for our spiritual development. The person without a problem is to be pitied. and the person with many problems is to be envied, because it is only in the working out of these problems that we attain spiritual awareness. God doesn't give us these problems. Our need provides them. And if you can imagine anyone enjoying normal health and a sufficiency of supply and a moderate amount of family happiness, being at all concerned about finding God, you would be knowing a miracle. Such things rarely exist as people desiring to know God, who haven't some deep down reason for having to know God, having to find God. Oh yes, here and there may be a natural-born mystic whose entire path is already on the spiritual way, but that is only because that natural-born mystic has been through previous lifetimes and worked out the problems that we are working out here and now. You don't have to go any further than watching yourself to see how you let down after your problem has been met and there are no more pains and no more lacks and no more unhappiness. Now watch yourself for the next month and see whether or not you are still as desperate to find God. And then you will understand why it is that the only way we have of progressing back to the Father's house is in the degree of our lacks, limitations, discords, and inharmonies. They drive us. What methods of relaxation before meditation are best to use? The book, The Art of Meditation and Practicing the Presence, are two complete books on that subject, and another one is First, Second, and Third San Francisco Lectures. And I can assure you that it would take more than all evening to repeat what is in those books. And everything on that subject is in any one of those books. What vision, if any, is entertained during meditation? That's an impossible question. There are as many visions in meditation as there are people meditating, multiplied by 1,000 times. Because each person who attains meditation in their lifetime probably attains hundreds and probably 1,000 different visions. Just one person. And then what about all of the tens of thousands of people who meditate? There's no way of answering that except by experience. Miss Eddy states a knowledge of error and its operation precedes that demonstration of truth, and so forth. Is this the same as you teach about material experiences operate under a material law? I don't think so. I don't know exactly what she means, but I would assume that she means that it is necessary to know the non-power of error before you can hope spiritually to demonstrate harmony, because the person who accepts error as a reality and fights it and battles it and wars against it and tries to rise above it, overcome it, or destroy it, they never in the world can demonstrate harmony through spiritual means. Demonstrating harmony through spiritual means actually to understand how error operates, what it operates as, and the nothingness of it except in the lives of those who accept two powers. old spaceships are guarding us. Can you give us your version of this? I never even heard of it. It's something that hasn't come within realm of my awareness. I haven't even heard that there are spaceships. Beyond the fact that there are claims of spaceships. So far as I know, and I have read 2 recent reports by our government, and their claim is that they have no knowledge of any, and that they have investigated every claim and have not yet found one worthy of belief. That is right from a government report. What was Jesus meaning when he said, "Greater works than these shall ye do, because I go unto my Father"? I wouldn't know that, except that he had only a 3-year ministry, and probably he felt that with the centuries to come, that we would go further than he did. And of course, in one sense, we have already gone further. So far as the New Testament is concerned, all of his demonstrations of harmony were on what we will call the individual level. That is, he healed individuals who were sick, raised individuals who were dead, fed individuals who were hungry, and the only demonstration that I can remember of any wider action was that of stilling the storm. Now, since that time, the practice of the principles of Christianity, the very principles that he gave us, have been responsible for establishing and maintaining harmony in corporation and labor problems on very large scales, where not that everyone concerned was a metaphysician, but where probably only one concerned was a metaphysician, and yet the application of these principles has established harmony where there was discord and has maintained harmony over a period of years. Next, in 2 instances, the application of these principles has stopped epidemics in 24 hours. In less than 24 hours, epidemics that were almost out of control of materia medica were stopped when 3 practitioners were called in to these situations. In the same way, a dominion over erroneous activities of nature, such as tidal waves, hurricanes, has definitely been proved, not only in one instance, but in enough instances to know that these principles not only can be more widely applied, but have been successful. And then there are still wider applications, which at this time it is not right to make public. If he meant that the principles that he revealed would have wider application or in more national and international fields, then that has already been done. But in the sense that these principles in his own time and under his own ministry did everything they were called upon for and definitely proved the principle, there is no higher demonstration to be made. There is only a wider demonstration. And that, I am sure, has been done. Would you kindly explain how you go about praying for your enemies? And here, too, there is no answer to that. Prayer is so individual. And to begin with, there is no knowledge of man that can be called prayer. When you rightly pray, it isn't you that's praying. You are the instrument in which or through which God is uttering his word, and that is prayer. In other words, if you're in the kindergarten of metaphysics, all right, it is to be expected that for a little while you will pray to God and ask him to open the eyes of your enemies, or to bring light into his consciousness, or to reveal himself to the materialistic thought. And this will certainly lift up an individual to a higher sense of prayer, where the real prayer can begin. But for those at this level of consciousness, there should be no such thought about how to pray, not only in that way, but in any other way. Because by now it should be clear that we do not pray in the sense of prayer as it is ordinarily understood in church, that whatever we do of praying in that way is only for the purpose of lifting ourselves up to a preparation for the real prayer. And the real prayer is the still small voice that utters itself in our consciousness. Now, is it not clear to you that there are no words or thoughts on your part that is going to make God do anything for anybody? Is it not clear to you by now that God cannot be influenced by man? And therefore, any praying of that kind belongs back to the middle of the 19th century, and to those who are still living from a religious standpoint in the 19th century. For you, this must be understood. I do not know how to pray. I do not know how to go out or how to come in. I do not know what to pray for. Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. Let thy spirit make intercession with my spirit. Let thy voice be heard in this earth. Thou utterest thy voice, the earth melteth. And then bring yourself into an atmosphere of listening. Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. I will listen for thy voice. Then put yourself in the position of a person who has been called upon by some member of a family with the news that my wife or my husband or my child is dying. Please pray for them and help them. Are you egotistical enough to believe that you would know how to pray to save a human life? Heaven forbid that anyone following this work should believe that they have such power, such wisdom, as to know how to pray. There is no way except the way of silence. Speak, Lord. Speak, Lord. Let yourself be heard in this earth. Voice yourself through me. Speak to me. Assure me of thy presence. And it isn't that God is hearing and going to answer. It is that you are preparing yourself for the voice that is already there. In other words, you are tuning in to an omnipresent voice. The presence of God is always with you. And the only reason you don't know it is that you are thinking and speaking. If only you could learn to stop thinking and stop speaking, you would be surprised at how quickly you would hear the still small voice, how quickly you would receive the assurance of God's presence. Try to come out from this old theological belief that there is some kind of a mysterious God somewhere that is going to do you a favor because you ask it, or your minister, or your practitioner. There is no God to do you a favor. There is no God to step out of its orbit and do something a minute from now that it wasn't doing a minute ago. To receive God's grace, you don't start God in action. You become still and become aware of a divine presence that is as close to you as breathing, and it's as near as hands and feet. It's nearer than hands and feet. As a matter of fact, it is the divinity of your own being. It is your own higher self or higher consciousness, and it is the Christ that is as available today as it was 2,000 years ago. Only don't believe for a minute that you have to ask favors of it, or that you have to direct it to do anything to anybody. All that you are called upon to do is learn to be still and know that I, the very presence of God in you, is God. Be still and know that I, in the midst of thee, is God. Be still and let it utter its voice. Only then can the dead be raised, or the dying. Only then can these incurable diseases be cured. They can't be cured by knowledge. They can't be cured by discovering some new way to pray. Why, in the literature of the world, prayers have been uttered in every way that man can possibly think, and it is too late now to think of new ways of praying, or new combinations of words and sentences, or new postures. It makes no difference to God whether you're sitting in the lotus position or standing on your head. It makes no difference to God whether you're lying down in bed or sitting up in a chair. In fact, it makes no difference to God whether or not you pray. But it makes a difference to you, and it makes a difference to those for whom you are seeking help. And the way is not through words and thoughts. That's back in our baby days of metaphysics. Any words and thoughts we use now in prayer or treatment are merely temporarily used for the purpose of elevating our own consciousness, not with the purpose of influencing God, just for the purpose of elevating our own consciousness. And then it has to be spontaneous. It can't be a combination of words written by somebody else. It has to be as spontaneous as your own expressions of love for your parents or your children or your husband or wife. I suppose at some level of consciousness it's all right to send out these greeting cards that can be bought in the stores at Christmas or New Year's or Easter or birthdays or anniversaries. But to me, they're sad. They're sad, showing the poverty, the spiritual poverty and the love poverty of those who have to have recourse to a message that somebody else writes, as if I wouldn't know how to write a message to my own mother or my own wife without somebody else putting the words in my mouth. How can they know what I feel? And how can I help knowing what I feel? And so it is when I go to prayer, I don't want to know how somebody else prayed. If they were somebody of the stature of a master, be assured of this: their prayer was inspired by their love. Whether they were praying for the servant of the centurion or the man born blind, you can be assured that the prayers of Jesus were inspired, not what some Hebrew masters had written, but what his love dictated from within his own being. Very much like Peter and John. Have you anywhere in literature read those marvelous words spoken to the man at the temple gate, beautiful? When he asks for alms, and the reply is, "Silver and gold have I none, such as I have give I unto thee." Now, can you imagine anyone in the history of the world ever having said that before? And can you imagine the miracle that took place through that spontaneous prayer? The man jumped up leaping. And so it is, when you pray, don't look for formulas. Don't think about how anybody else prayed. Be spontaneous, and you will be spontaneous if you are praying seriously. If you really want to help somebody, if you really have a love in your heart for somebody, or if you really have love for wanting to bring God's grace to earth, the words will bubble up in you, the thoughts will bubble up in you, and they won't be yours. They will be God's imparting themselves to you. You will be the listener. You will be the one listening for that still small voice, and then it will say, what did hinder you? Would you ever think of a prayer like that? What did hinder you? Pick up your bed and walk? No. But try to use it and see if it'll work for you. And you'll find it won't. Not unless it spontaneously rushes through your mouth without your even knowing that it is on the way. Prayer must be spontaneous, and prayer must be motivated by love. I don't know how we can pray for anything unless there is love within us that wants to see that something or other take place. And if there's that much love, all we have to do is go inside of ourselves with love and probably beg and plead for a little while for our own consciousness to be opened, and then the very power of love will pray within us. Now, when I'm called upon for help, please be assured of this, that I do not use words or thoughts, that I do not go through any routine of treatment or prayer. I do sometimes have to remind myself of these Bible promises. I do often have to remind myself that this that is appearing to me isn't a person or a condition, but a state of mesmerism, just a universal belief in two powers that has become so strong a belief that it acts mesmerically. I have to remind myself of that. I have to remind myself that evil in any form is impersonal, that it does not have its rise in man, that no man, woman, or child is responsible for the ills that befall them, except in the sense of their ignorance of truth. But aside, and that of course we're all guilty of, but aside from that, no one is responsible for their ills. It is a metaphysical error to believe that you are the cause of your rheumatism, or that it is because of your nature, or your disposition, or your character. It has nothing to do with it whatsoever. Nothing whatsoever. It can happen to the unborn child. It can happen to the newborn child that hasn't begun to think anything. We talk about cancer being the result of jealousy and of hate. And just think of how many babies are born with cancer. One picture in the paper here the other day of a child 2 years of age with cancer. Do you believe it hated that much or was envious that much at 2 years of age to produce a cancer? That was all a lot of metaphysical mythology that had its origin in up in Maine, long before it had a chance to be tried out in any wider sphere than a half a dozen people. It is metaphysical superstition to believe that any individual is responsible for their sins or their diseases. Paul rightly said, I do not sin, but there is still a sense of sin in me. In other words, he himself had had the Christ experience, and therefore there was no trace of sin in him, and yet there remained in him some sense of sin that he knew about. But he knew he wasn't responsible for it. It was a universal belief. Had Paul not made the mistake of believing that the carnal mind is enmity against God, Paul would have saved the entire world. By now, wars would have been so many centuries in the past that we wouldn't even remember that they had ever existed. It was only the mistake of believing that the carnal mind is enmity against God. There is no such thing. There is no enmity against God, for there is no other power but God. God is omnipotence, and that rules out forever any power against God. And therefore, all that we are doing to constitute our humanhood is entertaining a sense of sin, or entertaining a sense of a power apart from God, or accepting the universal belief in two powers, that which drove Adam and Eve out of Eden. The belief in two powers. Now come on up to the 20th century. Be awake, be alert, and realize this, that when evil in any form is presented to you, whether it appears as a person, or a condition, or a disease, or a strike, or a war, or an epidemic, don't fight them, don't war against them. Stop where you are, and smile. Smile at the very idea that we should entertain the belief in two powers. Smile at the very idea that this universal mesmerism can act with power when only God can give power, ordain power, express power. No, praying in our sense of the word, and especially praying without ceasing, is a constant reminding of ourselves that there is but one power, and this that appears to me as an erroneous person, erroneous condition, erroneous circumstance, this is the carnal mind, which is not enmity against God. It is the arm of flesh, or nothingness. It is temporal power, or nothingness, since temporal power isn't power, only God is power. Yes, there are material forces and powers, and there are mental forces and powers on the human level of life, and while you're on that level of life, matter is always warring with matter, and mind is always warring with mind. But don't ever believe that God enters the picture. Don't ever believe that these war with God, And don't ever believe that God wars with these. For in thy presence is fullness. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. There's no such thing as warfare where God is. Therefore, do not battle error, but rise in consciousness to the realization that material forces and powers and mental forces and powers, since they are temporal, are not power. They only act as power in the consciousness of those who accept them as power. And I can offer you 90 years of metaphysical demonstration as proof that this is true. Think of how many practitioners and teachers in the last 90 years have walked into bedrooms with where infectious and contagious diseases were, and we have no record of any one of them coming out with the infection or the contagion. Think of how many practitioners and teachers in this last 90 years have exposed themselves to all the diseases of the world, and we have no record that any of them took them upon themselves. Why? Because in the consciousness imbued with the Christ, there are no powers operating. There is only presence operating. Omnipresence, the presence of God, the presence of Christ. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is no opposition, no warfare, nothing of that nature. We do not war with principalities or powers. We war only with the belief within ourselves that there are powers. And there aren't powers at all. There is just presence. In thy presence is fullness. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. So, remember that the Master would not have said, resist not evil, if evil had a power. It wasn't his mission on earth to get us into trouble. And he would have gotten us in lots of trouble by telling us not to resist evil if evil were a power. Therefore, have confidence in the message and the mission of the Master, and resist the temptation to fight evil, to war against it, to rise above it, to overcome it. And always in the presence of it, relax in the assurance that it exists only as a mirage exists. It exists only as an illusion exists. It exists only as Maya exists, as a belief in two powers. I find an increased sense of disharmony when I had hoped for peace and inspiration in these meetings. What should I do about this? Rejoice. Rejoice and rejoice. Did not the Master say, I have not come to bring peace but a sword? Do you not know that the action of truth in our consciousness is to make trouble for us? It is to root out of us everything that needs rooting out in the way of false beliefs. And isn't this inharmony and discord our resistance to its operation? We don't want to let go of our previous conceptions. We don't want to let go of the patterns of yesterday. We as human beings never want to break away from the old forms. Do you not know that there was enough time for probably, well, at least half of all the Jews who were destroyed by Hitler? There was enough time for every one of them to have left Germany and be in the United States before all that began. And they knew it was coming. But you know, it's the old story. Oh, I can't give up my home. Oh, I can't leave my city where I was born. Why? Well, I want to die there. They did. Don't you know that back in the days of New England, the pioneers who came over and found nothing but snow and blizzard and cold and freezing, and in summertime 102 degrees, many of them stayed there. Many of them stayed there. That's as far as they got. That's as far as they got. The wise ones got that far, saw that weather, and picked up and said, what's ahead can't be worse than this. Let's go. And they found California, and they found Colorado, and they found the South. But not these humans of inertia. They weren't going to be stirred. So it is with us. Don't forget that we have been carrying a false image of God throughout our entire Orthodox religious life. And don't forget that many have even carried a false image of God through their metaphysical life, maybe up to this very minute. And if so, you're going to have to overcome every single concept of God you entertain until you haven't a concept left in your head to rely on. Because if you are relying on any concept of God that you have entertained or may now be entertaining, you're in a hopeless place. Because when you need God, it won't be there. Because your concept of God is not God. And you are not really finding God as long as you have a concept of God in your head. So remember that as truth is presented to you and it contradicts all the things you've believed all your life, you are being called upon to surrender those concepts. And of course, until you do, you will feel discord and inharmony when you are in the presence of truth. In the same way, I know that there are too many students who believe that because they are on this path 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, that all of their problems are going to be dissolved. Okay. Now, we are not going to move from material consciousness to spiritual consciousness in a short time. And as long as there is a trace of material consciousness left in us, it will externalize itself in some form of error, discord. That is why the question is often asked in class, why is it that practitioners and teachers who have done fine work for many, many years often come into the experience of serious discords at some time or other? And the answer is just this, that whatever trace of human belief still abides in us will and must externalize itself. And the chances are that none of us have completely reached the place where we could say with the Master, I have overcome the world. We may have overcome a good part of the world. We may be at a state or stage of consciousness where most of the world's problems go right by us. But I'm sure, at least I haven't met any yet, who claims to have made the demonstration of completely overcoming the world and thereby not experiencing some form of discord or other at some time or other. So it is, more especially for the younger students, to believe that because they've been on this path a few years, that they are ready to enter the kingdom of God and just sing la-di-da for the rest of their days. Pluck a harp. Don't you believe it? Don't you believe it? we are working out the entire experience of material consciousness, a state of consciousness that has been in us ever since the most ancient and ancient of days. Do you know that there has been no change in the world's concept of God for 4,000 to 5,000 years? That the paganistic beliefs of those people of 2,000 and 3,000 years BC are the same concepts of God that are entertained in all churches on the face of the globe today, except the metaphysical movements. And the metaphysical movements have only come a step out of that. They still have a distance to go before they realize and before they change their textbooks to reveal that God is not to be influenced by man, that God doesn't go out to do man's work for him, that God isn't a servant for mankind, that God doesn't obey man's wishes. Yes, there is a way of using the subconscious mind to do that for you. There is a way to use the mental levels of life to do that for you. But to call that God is heresy. The subconscious mind isn't God, nor is mind itself God. Mind is but an instrument that is given to us the same as our bodies are given to us. Our body is given to us for specific uses and functions, and so is the mind. But that which governs the mind and the body is something called I. It is your true selfhood when you accept the dominion that was given to you in the beginning. Then you can say, I have a mind and I have a body. I was given this mind, or I formed this mind and this body for specific uses. And this mind cannot talk back to me, and my body cannot talk back to me, for I have been given dominion over my mind and my body. Now, you know, if we release that dominion to a sufficient extent, it's called insanity. In other words, there are other influences using our mind besides ourself. But there is no such thing as insanity to the individual who knows that I and my Father are one. And because of my God-given dominion, this mind is an instrument for my use, an instrument of awareness, an instrument through which I become aware, an instrument through which I learn, through which I know, through which I remember. But remember, there's always this I. Never forget this I. I train this mind, and I train this body. I train this mind in memory. I train this mind in learning, in knowledge, in gaining, in wisdom. I do this, all of this, because I and my Father are one, and I have been given God-given dominion over everything in the skies and the air and the earth and the waters beneath the earth. And this I which I am really is the divine Son of God. It is the Christ nature, the Christ self. When you know this, you do not have to take thought for what you shall eat. You do not have to take thought for where you shall live. because there is an I which is one with God, which reveals to you what you shall do today and tomorrow and the next day. And it really is the source of your skill, of your art, of your literature, of whatever capacities have been given to you. And it is your mind and your body that are the instruments for the carrying out of the divine will during your experience on earth. Now, to know him aright is life eternal. Please remember this. You never know God right while you give God a name. That is impossible. When you say God is life, or God is love, or God is spirit, or God is soul, and believe that that is God, you are really forfeiting your spiritual demonstration. True, these are the nature and character of God. They are not God. They are words in your mind. They are thoughts or concepts in your mind. You are only one with God in the silence, for there is no name to God unless we use the name discovered by Moses, taught by Jesus, I, and we dare not ever use that name aloud except in instruction. We dare not voice that name aloud, because when spoken it has the connotation of meaning my human selfhood, me, the human Joel. That is not God. I am God. But the moment I voice that, it isn't true anymore. It isn't true. It isn't, because that I refers to Joel, and that isn't God. But when inwardly, in this secret and sacred place, I realize I in the midst of me is God. This I of individual me is one with God, the Son of God, the offspring of God, the divine essence, image, likeness, being of God, expression of God, one with God, not separate and apart, but one. Then I am commencing to know the name and the nature of God. But for safety's sake, it is far better to entertain no concept of God, just to know that God is enough, is enough. God is, and that's all that I can know about God, but by relaxing, I let God govern my experience. But the moment I look to some word in my mind like love or life or principle or soul, all I'm doing is entertaining a concept of God that never can be God. You may entertain concepts of me, and I'm sure there could be 40-odd concepts of me in this room, but not one of them can be me. They will only be concepts in your mind, and you will never know how far from the reality your concept of me is. Only I can know myself, and therefore only I can know how wide from the mark is anybody's concept of me. And I've heard many, from A to Izzard. So please know this. Since you cannot really know God in the sense of knowing with the mind, so with prayer, don't believe that you know how through prayer.
to reach God. The Hebrews go into temple with their hat on. The Christians go in with their hat off, except that lady Christians should have their hat on in some churches. The Orientals go into their temple with their shoes off. We go in with the shoes on. You really believe God cares? And certainly you know that a treatment or prayer could not please God, regardless of how it was voiced, how grammatically, and we couldn't displease God, regardless of how ungrammatically it was voiced, because prayer is really the intent of the heart. Where there is love, prayer receives an answer, even when it is ignorantly voiced.
You see, we are coming back again to our major subject of this class, advanced work in spiritual healing. It is all right as a beginner to use the higher sense of prayer you know, as long as you are willing to be promoted out of it and keep on being promoted until you graduate. For when you graduate, it will only be when someone has called you and said, my relative or my child or my parent has been given only a day to live, and I'm turning to you for help. It is only in that condition that you will say, God forgive me for ever believing that I know what to do or how to do. And in that humility, God will speak. And when God speaks, he thunders. His voice comes and the earth melts. His presence is felt, and the discords and inharmonies are dissolved. This final question before our period of rest, I find the imagery in Letters to the Scattered Brotherhood especially helpful and quieting. Do you know of any other such inspirational material? I became a very unpopular man some years ago among a great many people because I refused to recommend books of a spiritual nature are individual to the individual and sacred, and the book that may take you right out of this world into the kingdom of God may leave another person untouched. And if you want the book that will do the most for you, turn within and seek guidance. And then when you feel the peace of God, give no further thought to it, and the book will be mailed to you very quickly by someone you never dreamed of. Or you'll wander into a bookstore and find it fall out of a shelf at your feet. Only don't take thought. Turn within for guidance. Be at one with God, and that which is yours, that which is necessary for you at the moment, will be provided for you. Please discontinue the practice of having faith in princes or listening to man whose breath is in his nostril for anything concerning your spiritual life. There is the presence of God within you, and if you turn to it seriously enough, it will guide you and lead you in the way that you should go. And then there will be no mistakes. And now our rest.